This is episode 67 of Changing the Face of Yoga. And I'm talking to Nikola Ellis, and she's going to discuss her research into anorexia and how yoga has assisted some people who have that. So let's listen. Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. Hello, this is Stephanie Cunningham, and this is Changing the Face of Yoga. And I have an exciting guest today. Her name is Nikola Ellis of Adore Yoga. And Nicholas is a certified yoga therapist and a psychotherapist. And she is very talented in many ways, but we're going to talk about yoga and eating disorders today. But we're going to start with just a little bit about research, just so that you'll understand where Nikola is coming from. Nikola is providing teacher training and yoga therapy training, and she has workshops and retreats, and she's quite an experienced teacher and therapist. And I think she'll have quite a bit to tell us. So welcome, Nikola. Is there anything else that you would like to add to that introduction?
Thank you. It's great to be here. No, that's fine. You've just about covered it.
Okay, great. I was watching a video of your presentation at a recent Yoga Australia conference, and you were talking about how we see all these headlines in the popular press about how yoga can help people with a variety of issues, breast cancer, back pain, stress, whatever. But you rightly made the point that there isn't a lot of detail that's given about those, and it can be misleading. And you're doing a research project with teenagers at a hospital in Sydney, particularly about eating disorders and yoga. So could you just talk a little bit about the issues with yoga research and how you've taken your analysis of that and then developed your own research or with others? I'm not sure how it came about, but we can go into that. So I just would like to know a little bit more and let the listeners know about yoga research.
Right. So I'm glad we started there, because research in yoga is a really important and it's a really exciting area, because it's just exploded in the last 10 years. And until about 10 to 15 years ago, there really wasn't much quality research on yoga for anything, certainly not that was being done in the West. There's always been a fair bit of research in India. But as a result of some of this research, there's been a lot of media attention, because yoga's huge, right? So many people in the population are practicing yoga. And it's being sold to people as this healthful, beneficial practice. And then they see in their Facebook feeds or in the news, on the media, that studies show yoga helps with cancer, or studies show that yoga can beat eating disorders or migraines or whatever it happens to be. And part of that is really great, because it brings more people into yoga. So over the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of people have come into Adore Yoga because they've seen a news report about the benefits of yoga in a study, or because they've been referred by a health professional like their GP or their oncologist, who has also read these news reports. So that's fantastic. The flip side of that is that most of the news reports don't go into any detail as to what these studies were actually measuring, and what they were doing in the studies, and what the results actually mean. So in a lot of these studies, what was being practiced and what was being measured was not what a lot of people may imagine yoga to be. So if you go down to your local health club or yoga school at lunchtime and do a 60-minute vinyasa class, that often bears very little resemblance to the practices that are being measured in these studies. So there is no one size fits all. It isn't the case that if you just do yoga, it is going to help your insomnia, your cancer, your anorexia. And in actual fact, it is possible that certain kinds of yoga in certain circumstances, depending on your health condition, can actually exacerbate your health issues or certainly make you not feel very good. And so without drilling down and looking at what was being measured, and without understanding the difference between high quality research, where you have a large sample size, where the methodology was really good, where the results have been properly analyzed and peer reviewed, compared to low quality research, which might just be based on hypothesis or observation or subjective qualitative research. Without understanding the difference between those, it can be quite easy to get a little confused about what kind of yoga really does help migraine, anorexia, whatever the health condition is. It's unclear to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So you've looked at these failings, shall we say, or maybe issues with this research. And now, how are you building your research for working with teenagers with eating disorders?
Well, I wanted an evidence base. That was the first thing. So I was invited into Westmead Children's Hospital. They have an outpatient program for adolescents with eating disorders, primarily anorexia nervosa and bulimia. And we were invited in because, surprise, surprise, the person running the program, the senior psychologist there, had seen studies showing that yoga can help with anorexia. And we really wanted to measure from the outset, well, what is helpful? Is this helping these kids? Is anything that we're doing causing any problems for them? How can we measure it? So in order to make sure that what we were doing was of high quality, was beneficial, I went and had a really good look at the literature. That's where it all starts. You go back and you look to see what research has been done on yoga and eating disorders and related issues. So that's how I started building the research project. And from that, we came up with some ideas on where we should go, what we should measure and how we should measure it. And that's when I got my reality check. As a rookie researcher, I really did not fully appreciate what was involved in quality research. So I had all these big ideas and big hypotheses, like let's find out if yoga does this. Let's find out if this is how it helps people. And of course, when it comes down to actually setting up the research conditions and measuring things, it's long, it's hard, it's difficult. You're constrained by all kinds of considerations. So I have yet to do the research that I really want to do. What I did with this project was start at the very start, the first baby step, to create the foundational circumstances that we hopefully can build on in the future.
Okay, well, what exactly did you do in this research? I mean, I know you're saying it's a baby step, and I totally understand that. You have to start somewhere, and research is far more difficult, I think, than most people realize, to actually come up with something that has some meaning. Where did you start with this?
Well, there were three things that I wanted to know about. Firstly, I wanted to know about interoception. That's a pretty hot topic these days. So interoception is about what you can feel on the inside. So there are a ton of little receptors in your body that are constantly taking soundings on what's happening with your digestion, what's happening with your blood pressure, what's happening with the enzymes and chemicals in your body, and then feeding that information back to you so that your body can maintain homeostasis, so that you can make the right decision. So if you feel hungry, you get a feeling in your body, you correctly interpret that feeling as hunger, and then you go get something to eat. So there's a lot of evidence that people with eating disorders, particularly anorexia, they have problems with interoception. They either have trouble feeling what they're feeling, or they have trouble interpreting what they're feeling. So I really wanted to look at how yoga impacts that. I also wanted to have a look at objectification and eating disorders. There's a strong evidence base for a link between self-objectification and eating disorders. And there's a lot of evidence that people who practice yoga are less likely to self-objectify.
Okay, could we have a definition of self-objection or self-objectify, just so everybody knows what that means?
Right. So so objectification is when you perceive somebody as less than the sum of all of their human parts. You reduce them to an object. And when we self-objectify, we take that sense of objectification in on ourselves. So as women, for example, if you take a feminist perspective, women are sexually objectified. If you look at the way that women are portrayed in the media, you never see older women in the media. You only see women of a particular body shape and size, and they're generally dressed in a way to please men. And so rather than looking at a whole woman, you just see this object that represents woman. And when women internalize that, when they believe that that is what they are, they're just an object rather than experiencing themselves as these whole complex beings, they self-objectify. So they place value on themselves based on how they look and certain aspects of their behavior, and they discount or do not value other aspects of themselves that are not valued or that they don't perceive as being valued in the wider society. And those thoughts and feelings and behaviors are directly linked to eating disorder behaviors. So low self-esteem, believing that you have to look and act in a certain way to be valuable and acceptable.
Okay.
Yoga helps with that. There is research that has been done on how people who do yoga tend to objectify themselves less. They have a more holistic experience of themselves. And then the third and final thing was trauma. There is a link between trauma and eating disorders. There are some studies that have suggested that up to 30% of people experiencing anorexia nervosa have experienced childhood sexual abuse. And while it is by no means true that sexual abuse causes eating disorders or people who have eating disorders have been abused, there is a correlation there. And so I wanted to understand how trauma-informed yoga, which we know from research does positively impact people with PTSD and living with trauma symptoms, can that improve the experiences and behaviors of people with eating disorders? So those are the three things I really wanted to look at. There was interoception, objectification, and trauma. So I did a whole bunch of research on that and found that, well, look, yeah, there's a lot of research to support those hypotheses. So how can we now measure that in our students with eating disorders? Which was the $1 million question.
Yes.
So I had this big, juicy, grand hypothesis. I was asking, could it be that trauma-informed yoga positively influences the behaviors of adolescents with anorexia by improving interoception and reducing self-objectification? That's what I want to know. Man, that's such an exciting, hypothesis. And I got really excited about how we could do that. And then I got my reality check. The first reality check is that we were in a public hospital. I was doing this through the University of New England, and you have to put this stuff through ethics committees. Uh-huh. So quality research starts with an ethics committee. You've got to come up with a question that is good and a methodology that is good, and you have to conduct it in a way that is sound and ethical. And the ethics committee took one look at my submissions. Well, they took several looks over 6 months, actually, and said, no, you are working with children with a severe mental health problem. You may not use these children as guinea pigs. And it didn't matter how I cut it. I've been doing this work with these kids for nearly 2 years by the time I applied to the ethics committee, and that they just weren't having a bar of it. So, yeah, that was a real problem. So we were not allowed under any circumstances for this particular project to actually directly measure the effects of the practice on the students, even though we were doing the practice with them. Seems a bit crazy, doesn't it?
Well, it does. I mean, doesn't this group want to know what helps them? I mean,
yeah, they do.
Okay.
but it's too big a risk. So I think for a first-time researcher, I think had I cut my teeth on several previous projects, had I been collaborating with superstar researchers who had already published a ton of stuff, then we probably would have been able to move ahead, but it would have been a much more complex project. So as it was, we did use some data that we'd taken from the kids in the previous 18 months. Like we'd already been doing little pre and post scales to find out how the girls were feeling before they did the practice, how the girls were feeling after they did the practice, how they were at the beginning of a 10-week program, how they were at the end of a 10-week program. So we knew from our informal research that it was really helping. That they loved it and that they really look forward to it. And anecdotally speaking to the mental health nurses and the psychs on the outpatient program, they also believed that it was helping. It improved behavior, it improved mood. The girls responded well to it. So anecdotally, it was a successful program, but we were not allowed to measure it academically in a way that we could then publish and that would be meaningful research. So I went back to the drawing board.
I admire your persistence.
I wasn't giving up.
Okay, good. And what did you do next?
So we did the next best thing. Well, we had to get this through quickly at this point because, you know, my this was part of a master's degree and it was never going to end. And I really wanted to complete my master's. So we decided to make it as uncontroversial as possible. And the way that we would do that was by sampling the teachers who were in there teaching. So we took what we knew from the information from the kids we'd been teaching. We took what we knew from the mental health nurses and the psychologists, and then we conducted interviews with the teachers who were in there on the ground delivering this yoga program to the kids in the eating disorders unit every week. And we asked them, what do you see? What do you notice? What's working? What isn't? How are the kids responding? What would you change? What's happening in the environment? What do you observe? So that's the angle that we went for it. And of course, the ethics committee loved that because it means that we don't actually have to, that it was very low touch for the kids themselves. And it turned out to be a really positive thing, actually. I was really delighted that we ended up taking this approach because as a yoga teacher and a yoga teacher trainer, what we ended up with was a set of recommendations that we can use to guide or train or advise yoga teachers working in this space, and also a set of recommendations for clinicians. So there are psychologists, psychotherapists, mental health practitioners who want to integrate yoga into the mental health programs for eating disorders, but they don't know where to start. They don't understand the difference between this kind of yoga and that kind of yoga. And so these guidelines are proving really helpful for clinicians working in this space. So it's actually turned out to be pretty useful.
Great, great. Now, I would assume that all of these, even though they're different teachers, and of course we all have our own way of doing things, they would be following a set sequence or program so that it's all similar across? Or did you want to see maybe the differences that different approaches might make?
Right, that's a good question. We decided to standardize. One of the problems with yoga research in general is that there is little or no standardization. So you might read 2 articles in the press that say there's been studies that show that yoga helps with depression, right? And so one of the studies was done last year and one done this year. So you may think, oh, well, that kind of proves yoga's really good for depression. But when you look at the methodology, like one was a Bikram class and the other was an Iyengar class, or one was pretty much pranayama and yoga nidra and the other one was much more vinyasa oriented. So you're not comparing apples with apples. This is a real problem with yoga research, is that you're constantly comparing apples and oranges, which makes it really difficult to make a case for any particular practice being helpful. So to make it easier for measurement purposes and also to make it easier for future researchers, we were very clear about the methodology that we were using, the kind of classes and techniques we were using, so that it could be replicated. And in research, that's really important. You have to be able to replicate what you do, because otherwise you can't prove or disprove that it works. So I produced a set of, that we were running them in the classes in 10-week terms. And so I produced 10 45 to 50 minute classes that were, I built a template that said, and each time a teacher went in, there were different teachers. They had to teach what was on the template. So there was very little wriggle room for them to be creative. I'm sure that was very frustrating for them. But they just had to teach what was on the page so that we knew what had been delivered. And they could adapt. They were always open to adapt. If something wasn't working, they weren't to just kind of push on through. They were able to adapt and modify. But we needed to know what they were teaching. And it was all trauma-informed yoga. So it used trauma-informed principles, principles that come out of the Vini Yoga tradition of Krishnamacharya, because that's my training ground. And they weren't, each class was, it was slightly different each class. It wasn't one single practice that got repeated, but there was similarity. So it was in the same kind of vein, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So we did standardize it, yeah.
And because you have a background in yoga therapy, were these templates that you developed, did they have kind of because I do know that yoga therapy is different from yoga teaching, which is often it's with one person and it's very individualized, but I'm sure there are some overall concepts that could be applied to a population of teenagers with these eating disorders. So would it have looked like a regular yoga class to anybody, or did it have really some specifics for that population?
It would have looked, well, it depends. Well, what's a regular yoga class?
Well, that's true. That's true.
So it was designed according to the principles of yoga therapy, which means that we look at the condition of eating disorders through the lenses of yoga. So we would be taking an Ayurvedic approach. We would be understanding what is happening with the koshas, the doshas, the vayus, the kleshas, and understanding according to yogic philosophy how we need to apply the principles of yoga to meet the particular patterns that are present in that population of adolescents with eating disorders when you look at those patterns through the lenses of yoga therapy. And also, remember, we were applying the principles of trauma-informed yoga. So the languaging was very, very different to the languaging that you would get in a regular yoga class. So everything was very invitational. There is no alignment. At no point does anyone say, turn your back foot out 45 degrees and bring your front foot forwards 1.5 meters and square your shoulders. No. So people were invited, when you're ready, if it feels good, try stepping your left foot back. How's that? If you feel you want to step it back a bit more to be comfortable, you can try it. Otherwise, just stay where you are. Okay. So it was a very different kind of languaging that trauma-informed yoga teachers will be very familiar with, but seem quite unusual to people who are used to being told where to put everything. And there was no specific alignment cues if the students were practicing things in a way that, so everything was gentle enough. There was no way that they were going to hurt themselves doing this practice if they weren't properly aligned. But some of the students occasionally would go far more deeply into a posture than they have been invited to do, because it won't come as a surprise to know that some of these adolescents with eating disorders have backgrounds in dance and gymnastics. And so you ask them to move into a lunge and your eyes are watering when you see what they do. You're like, no, stop. So rather than go in and say, oh, no, don't do it like that. Move your foot, change this. We would say, okay, and move back to standing in mountain pose, take a breath, and now we'll do something else. So it wasn't about correcting and making things right, because perfectionist tendencies are absolutely part and parcel of these eating disorders. So instead, our design was to empower these girls, to give them choice. They have no choice in their lives. They have no choice. And one of the ways that they're trying to exercise choice and control over their lives is through the restricted eating. And the irony is that once they're on this program, they have no choices. They don't even get to go to the bathroom on their own, because once they do, they may self-harm or they may compulsively exercise. So these girls' lives are completely controlled. They don't get to say, all the things that regular teenagers get to choose, what they eat, where they go, nothing. And so the trauma-informed yoga was designed to empower these girls. You can do this or you can't. Which feels better, to do it like this or do it like that? And nobody's asking these girls what actually feels good to you. Would you like to do this or would you like to do that? You choose, and always choose what makes you feel good. within the boundaries of what is healthy. Because those girls left to their own devices, if you tell them to do what feels good, they will starve themselves and they will exercise to a point of collapse. So it's a controlled choice environment, and it's pretty much the only controlled choice environment they were getting.
So I just have a question about, you wanted to look at all three areas that might be reasons for people to have eating disorders, but I think you got it down to, you wanted it to be interoception and objectification. I just was wondering, it seemed to me that when you put your research together, you were talking about two very different things. One was interoception and the other was objectification. And I was wondering how you see those two going together in one research project.
Yeah, now I don't.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, it's big. This comes down to the way in which emotions and perceptions are formed. So we think that emotions kind of spring up fully formed, like we're born with this set of emotions and then we just feel things and then we act according to our feelings. And it's not really like that. So we have these interoceptive experiences, many of which we have no conscious awareness of, but they're going on all the time. And they're happening, even the ones that we have conscious awareness of, those bodily sensations, those interoceptive experiences happen before we have conscious awareness. So in order to know how we feel emotionally, we have to know what these internal feelings are. So when we experience a sensation on the inside, however subtle it is, we then ascribe an emotion or a feeling to it. And that emotion then determines how we think and then how we act. So for example, if I get a particular sensation from the inside, I might not even be able to define it and go, it's a pain or it's a gurgle. It might be something really subtle, but I just feel something going on in my body. Now, I may decide, oh, that means I need to go to the bathroom, or I'm hungry, I need to eat something. I just feel a little bit empty. And so I'll have a fairly neutral emotional response to that, and I might go make a sandwich. Somebody who has an eating disorder may have the same kind of visceral interoceptive experience, but they may interpret that as threat, as fear. And that may be because of a whole bunch of stories and experiences in their past. So when you have a feeling in your body that you experience as fear and as a threat, you're not very likely to go and make a sandwich. You're more likely to act out in a way that is inconsistent with the meaning of the feeling that you're having on the inside. So in order to behave in a coherent way, we need to not only be able to feel what we're feeling on the inside, we need to be able to interpret that. And people who can't feel what they're feeling on the inside, they're more likely to suffer from a condition called alexithymia, which is when you cannot explain or understand or identify your emotions. And alexithymia is very high in people with anorexia. So the way that you feel in your body directly impacts your emotional experience, which then determines how you think, which decides how you act. So can you see this kind of like this longitudinal?
Yes. No, I understand.
There, right?
Okay. So eating disorders, I will admit that it has not been an area I've done much research in, but it's much more complex than I was aware with my admittedly shallow information. So it could be quite difficult to, first of all, decide what's actually happening, and then secondly, whether yoga is actually helping that. So it's quite, you've really taken on quite a project there, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, where we were starting at, what we really wanted to know baseline was, okay, can you feel what you're feeling and can you tolerate it? Because part of the problem with these adolescents is that they would either not be able to pay attention to feel what they're feeling, or, and it can be part of the same problem, is that feeling what they were feeling was overwhelming and unpleasant and frightening. So imagine if you have a hunger pang and you experience that as a threat, you're going to want to move away from that feeling pretty quickly or do something to make it go away. So what we wanted to do in the yoga classes was to teach, which is a key principle of trauma-informed yoga. This is how traumatized people behave. They're overwhelmed by the signals from their body and they try desperately to stuff it down, to move away from it, to act out in ways that allow them to not experience that. So we designed the classes to give these kids a safe space to stop and go, oh, how am I feeling? Whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, it's okay. I can stay with this feeling for a moment, and then I can move forwards into the next moment, and I'm just fine. So teaching them through mindfully experiencing their bodies, teaching them to pay attention to the feelings coming from their body, not just run away or override those feelings, and then be present to them, if only for a very short time, to not act out, to not suppress, to just be present to those feelings, know it's okay, and then move forward into the next moment, whatever that brings. So that was the practical application of that hypothesis theory.
All right. I can understand that. So if someone out there in the listening world wanted a copy of these protocols that you've developed, if they would like to work with teenagers who have these issues, are those available, or is it more just for, shall we say, the medical professionals?
No, I have written that up in a way that makes it pretty easy to understand. That's I because there's the research project itself, which is all written in academic speak, which is just boring, basically, unless you love that stuff. But I've put the presentation, so I kind of distilled all of the research information and those recommendations for the presentation that you were talking about that I did at Yoga Australia. And I've put that onto the Adore Yoga blog that's got a video recording plus my notes plus slides from the presentation. And if anybody wants the actual research, I'm really happy to send that to them if they've got the time and the patience.
Okay, great. So that would be at www.adoreyoga.com. And
that's right. And then go into the blog or in the search facility on that website. Look at the blog post is actually called How to Teach Yoga for Eating Disorders. And it's on there. Or you can contact me at info@adoreyoga.com and I'll email it to you.
That's wonderful. Okay, great. So we know that you weren't allowed to measure whether the teenagers had any difference because of these yoga, but anecdotally, do you feel that there was some positive benefits for them also?
Absolutely. Yeah. Anecdotally, from speaking to the girls themselves, from the little pre and post test that we did with them, from the clinicians in the hospital and the observations of the yoga teachers, it was overwhelmingly positive. It improved. So one of the things that the hospital really wanted to do with the yoga was to see if it improved what they called compliance with the program. So these girls, they're being asked to do a whole bunch of stuff to help their recovery that they do not want to do. And they perceive the clinicians and their parents as the enemy. And they're being asked to do these exercises, to do this therapy, to eat this food, and they are not always cooperative. And so they wanted to improve cooperation and compliance. And anecdotally, the yoga helped with that.
Okay. Well, that's good, because if that's what they were looking for, then it's always good to be able to show that helps. So I'm impressed with that. Nikola, this has been fascinating. It's really been interesting. And I want everyone to be able to contact you if they'd like. It's actually pretty easy. Your website is www.adoreyoga.com. The email address is Nikola@adoreyoga.com. And both Facebook and Twitter are Adore Yoga. So, and the Instagram name. So you're doing very well with your branding, I might add.
That was just luck, guys. You have to be an early adopter. You had to be an early adopter to get your chosen username. So I was pretty lucky there.
You were doing very well, yes. And so I really, really want to thank you. I think you've really brought some interesting, I love talking about yoga research. I'm not sure that everybody else does, but I think it's just really fascinating. And I think you've really brought up a really important point that, headlines are great, but they're to sell papers. And that doesn't really mean that it's helpful for someone looking for some yoga class, especially if they have some issue they'd like yoga to address. So I think you've done a really wonderful job of explaining this issue to us.
Oh, well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.